Here to begin this Endnote speaker session is once again Conference Chair Lloyd Kirk.
On now? Testing 1, 2, 3. All right, we're on now. Okay. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the breakout sessions, and I hope you got some nice food there to eat. I got some reminders on the lawyers that are signing up for continuing education credits. Please go to the committee resource. Where is that? The committee resource booth. Is that front? Okay, the agenda, okay, the committee resource booth, okay. I didn't know we had that. There's a committee resource booth on this side, but if you want your CE credits, you need to go sign in there. And I know we had a number of attorneys that were asking about that. Also, the attendees needed to turn their exhibitor card in that you've been signing by the exhibitor booths. Turn that also at the same booth. By when, did you say? Tomorrow? Okay, tomorrow by noon. Anyway, and then what else? Any other reminder list? Oh, we had on here for our session to eat tonight. I had a number of people come up to me. They thought they were eating at the Devon Tower. We're not eating at the Devon Tower. It's at the Chase Bank for the reception, which is just right north of the facility of the Skirvin. And literally just walk over there. It's the 34th floor, correct? 35? 35th floor? I'm not getting anything right. But anyway, but remember that, because you don't want to go to Devon, because they're only finished to the 32nd floor right now. So you wouldn't go to the 35th, so over there. But today we have two great Endnote speakers, and they're brought to us by Terracon. And we really have speakers that are going to talk about things that are Brownfields related that we need to work on. Our first speaker is a committed environmentalist who is passionate about restoring contaminated properties back to productive use. His practice focuses on environmental litigation. He has served as counsel to parties in transactions involving the transfer of contaminated properties. He is the lead counsel in the Ashley II of Charleston's versus PSC nitrogen case. Please welcome Tom Nolan Barefoot.
That music cracks me up. I feel like I'm a game show contestant or something. Thank you so much for staying around for the last session of the day. It's been a long day, very good, productive day and everything, but it is the last session, especially my presentation. I'm going to talk about a piece of environmental litigation that the trial court's ruling, I'm afraid, is just going to have a tremendously chilling effect on Brownfields development and everything, and it upset me tremendously, and I hope it doesn't upset you tremendously if you walk away depressed after this session. The hospitality reception does follow, and or either that or I'm counting on Matt Height to really pick you up with his final 30 minutes of the day. The other thing is there are so many issues in this case that need to be talked about and addressed, and I can't do them all at here. I'm going to try to pick out the highlights, and I want to focus it. I want to address my comments mostly to the non-lawyers. How does this affect Brownfields development? I've talked to folks that develop, the sites, and they are so concerned about some of the things that this ruling has. The lawyers can read the law and analyze the law and everything else. In terms of the state of the case, the decision was handed down last May 2011. It's on appeal to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond. My brief is due to be filed in Richmond next Friday, June the 1st. I am extremely stressed out about that, but I am happy to be here because this information needs to be communicated to the folks who are really in the battle for developing these sites. Because there is so much to address, I've been practicing. I'm going to be speed talking, and pardon me for just running on and on, but I want to cover these issues. In terms of the case, the title, it is Ashley 2 versus PCS Nitrogen. And let me say at the outset, PCS Nitrogen is not the party that was responsible for the contamination, didn't have anything to do with the site. It just had the unfortunate good luck to buy a corporation who bought a corporation that did all this stuff, or that did a lot of this stuff at the site. And it is the legal successor in interest to that liability, or at least that's what we contend, and that's what a principal issue in there were two trials in this action. One of the trials handled. The issues were successor liability of PCS, divisibility of harm at the site. That's important because if the responsible parties can prove that the environmental harm at the site can be reasonably allocated to their own portion, then their liability, both to EPA and to any innocent party, is limited strictly to the percentage of liability that the judge would assign to them. If the harm at the site is indivisible, then they are responsible for 100% of the cleanup cost, and then they have to go against other responsible parties trying to get their fair share. So PCS challenged that extremely vigorously. Ashley's status as a bona fide protective purchaser. In the 2002 Brownfields amendments to encourage the developments, there's a limitation of liability for a party that can prove in court that it stands in the shoes of a bona fide prospective purchaser, BFPP. The CERCLA statute sets out 8 conditions that you must prove in order to have this status. If you prove this status, then you have liability protection from EPA and from anybody else. And lastly, the litigation involved PCS bringing in contribution claims against everybody they could find that they could say was a responsible party, including the city of Charleston, South Carolina, that owned the street that went into this particular parcel, as well as some of the other owners of the very small sections of the site that really added no contamination. But that's what the case was about. The key rulings in the case were that PCS did have successor liability, harm at the site is not divisible, and the judge, and I'm not going to go over this issue, I'm not going to go over either one of those two issues. The judge issued a 120-page ruling, detailed findings of fact of 54 pages, 201 findings of fact. This is cutting edge law on whether or not the environmental harm at the site is divisible or not. She really did a fine job on it. I'm not going to address it. She ruled that Ashley failed to meet its burden of proving BFPP status. And on 3 particular elements, the affiliation, appropriate care, and disposal, I'll go over those in detail. And as I said, the case is currently on appeal to the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. The site is the Columbia Nitrogen Superfund site, which is a 43-acre parcel of land adjacent to the Ashley River in Charleston, South Carolina. EPA had Ashley purchased a majority of it in November of 2003, but EPA prior to that had already done a phase 1 RI, phase 2 RI, a complete feasibility study, and so we knew so much about the site when we actually took title to it. The harm at the site, it was a former phosphate fertilizer manufacturing facility, and there's lead and arsenic and low pH conditions in the soil, sediments, and groundwater. In 2005, EPA issued an enforcement action memorandum in which it came forth with its preferred selected remedy. The site is not on the national priority list. EPA said that it did qualify for a non-time critical removal action. Here's a photograph of the site. This is in 1985 when PCS's predecessor, Columbia Nitrogen Corporation, sold it to a couple of local Charleston developers. Holcomb and Fair are the names in the appeal. Columbia Nitrogen had demolished all the above-ground structures. They left a couple of concrete pads there, as you can see. The Ashley River's over to the left. This is a site, an aerial that just before Ashley purchased it in November 2003, Holcomb and Fair had divided the track into parcels used for container storage. It's very near the port in Charleston, and this gives a a good illustration. This is another illustration with an infrared photography showing, vegetation and so forth. But the red outlined provision section that you see, that's the section that Ashley purchased in 2003. I'll be talking later. Over to the far right side of the slide, you see a building and some trailers along that. That's the Always parcel. Ashley purchased that parcel in 2008, and that parcel has particular significance. Again, chronologically, Ashley purchased the majority of this site in two separate phases. Ashley, this parcel was part of an overall development called the Magnolia Development, which was 200 plus acres along the Ashley River outside of Charleston. Everybody was extremely excited about it. This development involved 20 separate contaminated parcels of property, 4 CERCLA sites, and 16 South Carolina voluntary sites. All of these sites, except all of these sites, were being cleaned up in conjunction with cooperation from a former owner operator, except for the Columbia Nitrogen site in the middle. Ashley, in the Magnolia project, we were getting the support from EPA, South Carolina Department of Environmental Health Control. EPA's letter exciting project consisted with EPA's mission, South Carolina DHEC. It's a prime example of the goals of the Brownfields program. Of course, Ashley, when it purchased it, this was 2003, right after the 2002 Brownfields amendments, wanted to take advantage of the limitation of liability provision that CERCLA provided. This morning we heard about President Bush's signing, and it was curious that many communities and entrepreneurs have sought to redevelop brownfields. Often they could not, either because of excessive regulation or because of the fear of endless litigation. I'm standing here after 8 years of litigation, it seems like, and the fear that he was trying to alleviate at that time is not gone, at least not gone entirely. There are some various EPA guidance documents. The most recent one, EPA's Revitalization Handbook, March 2011. It's got the pertinent EPA guidance documents in it, talks about various provisions. EPA's Common Elements guidance in 2003 dealt with bona fide prospective purchaser, innocent landowners, et cetera. The key issue, BFPP issues in Ashley, a BFPP has the burden of proving, we had to prove that all disposal of hazardous substances occurred on the site prior to our taking title, of course that we had made all appropriate inquiries, that we exercised appropriate care with respect to the hazardous substance found at the facility by taking reasonable steps with regard to those hazardous substances. And then the fourth one I'm going to talk about is that the person is not affiliated with any other potentially responsible party through a family relationship or through a contractual relationship, except those created by the instruments, for the purchase of the property. Reasonable steps I'll talk about first because that really has given heartburn to some of the folks I've been talking to the most. Reasonable steps to stop a continuing release, to prevent a future threatened release, and to prevent exposure. The Common Elements guidance, Congress intended to withhold liability protection only from those parties that completely ignored the dangers associated with hazardous substances on their property. If only that was the case of how it was being interpreted. Of course, during Ashley's ownership, they had prepared their own environmental site assessment, which incorporated the feasibility study, hired an environmental engineer with over 30 years experience at Superfund sites to ensure compliance with the BFPP requirements. We fenced and gated, provided security, did periodic site inspections, no trespassing signs. And a significant note, when we purchased the property, Ashley sent a letter to EPA saying Ashley has acquired the majority parcel of the Columbia Nitrogen site, and we request that EPA inform Ashley if EPA desires any specific cooperation, assistance, access, or the undertaking of any reasonable steps at the site. And the testimony trial was that EPA never requested anything of Ashley that Ashley didn't do. And I mean, EPA was so excited about this project, as well as the City of Charleston's mayor. The court finds that Ashley failed on 3 parts on this reasonable care, that there was a debris pile that Ashley allowed to accumulate and didn't investigate and allowed to stay on the site for more than a year. A protective limestone ROC cover on the site, Ashley supposedly allowed it to deteriorate. And then there's an issue about some sumps and concrete pads on that all-waste parcel. That was the one we purchased in 2008 that may have exacerbated the conditions and that there may have been possible releases from it. The debris pile itself, I'll show you, that's the infamous debris pile. Wooden pallets, straw, paper, packing, used tires. I mean, the tenants that were using those various parcels, they just, as their leases ran out, they just left, and they left this stuff. I mean, you can see all those used tires, and during the trial, at one point, the judge kind of rolled her eyes and said, used tires, we're talking about a Superfund site. I thought that was a pretty good sign at the times. EPA and South Carolina officials had been on the site. They walked on the site while the debris pile was there. It was no problem. Ashley had in place a program in the development of all of those parcels, again, for economies of scale, efficiencies of their contractors, to go and clean up the actual debris, just trash on these sites. But they started near Interstate 26, where it was most visible, and worked its way back to the sites that were off site from the highway, and they just hadn't gotten to the Ashley site. And PCS came out for a site inspection, saw the debris pile, and really raised havoc. And we ultimately removed the debris pile. PCS came out and did sampling, and underneath took bias sampling, trying to find contamination. There was nothing there. You may see in the court's opinion, they cited, well, there were hazardous waste manifests for waste sent off site, by Ashley. And they cited hydrochloric acid. There was a 5-gallon container of a cleaning material that was sitting outside a trailer that one of the tenants had left, and that's the hazardous waste manifest for the hydrochloric acid hazardous substance. There were 9 1-gallon used paint cans that were found in the debris pile. Those were also just thrown on the manifest as well. In terms of scale, that shows the location of the debris pile in January of 2006, just a very tiny little spot in one far corner. That's while that tenant was still on the site. The ROC limestone cover, back in the 90s, the Holcomb Fair, who had purchased the property, and EPA became aware of contamination, and limestone was put over the property, not 100%, but over 80%. From the old former phosphate fertilizer manufacturing site, there was this substance called pyrite that was used back in the early 1900s. That was littered all over the land, and that's what contains the lead and the arsenic. And so the ROC covers it up and helps drainage and prevents exposure. Again, the court found that we let it deteriorate in 2004 and 2006. EPA was on the site for weak testing in 2005. They didn't have a problem. EPA and South Carolina officials inspected the site in 2007. Again, no mention. There was an instance in which Ashley did, in a periodic inspection, walk the site, see staining on the soil, said, we better investigate, had its environmental consultants come out, do sampling. It was lead and arsenic from the old pyrite. We brought in fresh ROC, covered it up, and so forth. Ashley also had retained an expert witness for purposes of trial that had decades of experience at CERCLA sites and at 4 former phosphate fertilizer plant sites to evaluate Ashley's activities. Had they exercised reasonable care, due care, et cetera, and he opined that they did. There was no evidence that there was any release from any deterioration of ROC. This illustrates the red triangle. That's the actual figure that the judge cited in her order as saying, look, see, the ROC is deteriorated. Well, there certainly is a lot of vegetation there, and it's darker. Back in 2003, this is, again, before Ashley purchased it, again, you see the vegetation, and again, you see, soil that apparently had rained. And then again, in January of 2006, that dense vegetation and soil. That was not a portion of the parcel that the trucks actually ran over back and forth. But that's, if you read the opinion, that's the ROC problem. And again, there was no evidence, scientific evidence. In fact, the court found the record does not establish any affirmative release of hazardous substances after Ashley took title to the property. And yet we still lost the FPP status. Always concrete pads and sumps. Always was a truck washing facility, cleaned them out. Rinse water went into sumps. The sumps cycled the water back to its treatment, on-site treatment facility, then cycled it into the city sewer. In the pre-purchase ESA, they looked at the sumps and there was some staining, some cracks. Yeah, that needs to be checked out. And so Ashley, took title anyway, and in 2008, May 2008, they took title to it. Before that, All Waste had relocated their facility. They took all their equipment and everything else, moved it out, and they, of course, had to close their facility pursuant to the RCRA regs. There's a letter in the file by the environmental consulting firm saying, before we leave, we're going to pump out and clean the sumps and the trenches and the lines and so forth. Ashley took title in May 2008. We came in and we removed the above ground structure above the All Waste. All that was left was the concrete pad and concrete sumps, which were built into it. And we had seen that all the liquid was out of the sumps. We assumed All Waste had done what they said they were going to do. Our engineer looked inside. He said, I saw some windblown dirt in the sumps in the trenches. And besides, at that point, again, in the redevelopment schedule, Ashley had already contracted with a contractor at various sites to go out and remove the concrete pads and sumps and structures all at one time. The efficiency of scale to do this, but they just hadn't gotten to it on the All Waste site. And then, of course, the fall of 2008 came with the recession, which totally blew the entire development schedule out of the water. And so that's why it happened. PCS wanted to come back out to the site and test. Well, when they came out to the site, the sumps were filled with water because the structure was gone, rain had come in. They looked horrible. I was out there. I mean, there was algae growing in it. There was some black stuff. Well, we thought, oh my God, this is horrible. Well, they tested the stuff, and it had some heavy petroleum hydrocarbons, but our PhD chemist said, but it was all, so intermixed. He said that it wasn't really soluble in water. I mean, it wasn't going to migrate anywhere. Even if the sumps overflowed and the water went out onto the soil, there wouldn't be any release, and no release was found. But the judge said that no. We ultimately had the sumps after PCS tested. We had the sumps cleaned, filled with concrete, and they're still out there. But the judge said, too little, too late. The no affiliation issue really ought to give the Brownfields community heartburn because, Ashley had to show that we didn't have an affiliation with the responsible party other than one that was established through the contract documents in the EPA's 2003 Common Elements. It appears that Congress intended the affiliation language to prevent a PRP from contracting away its CERCLA liability. EPA intends to be guided by Congress's intent of preventing transactions structured to avoid liability. Again, in this case, Ashley's only relationships with responsible parties were with the sellers that it purchased the sites from. And in those contract documents, Ashley gave a release and an indemnity. In any kind of transaction or project I've been involved with, the seller always wants to get from the purchaser a release and an indemnity. This does not in any way take away its CERCLA liability to EPA or to any other party. This is purely just between the buyer and the seller. The judge, however, cited one additional piece of fact. And she said, Ashley, too, wrote a letter to EPA requesting EPA to release the Holcomb and Fair parties, those were our sellers, from liability for EPA's past response costs. And as I'll show you in just a minute, she said, oh, that's just the type of affiliation that the statute was meant to avoid. Well, the history was Ashley was negotiating a BFPP agreement with EPA at the time. Ashley was saying, we'll come in, we'll do the cleanup. Not only will we do the cleanup that EPA has in their action memo, we want to clean it up to residential standards because we want some residential units on this mixed-use thing. We'll pay all of EPA's future response costs. We'll do we'll comply with all the other onerous provisions that are in a typical EPA BFPP agreement. However, we've been engaged in this expensive litigation with PCS Nitrogen because EPA was reluctant to go. EPA had a question about whether the contractual successor and interest liability was really there, and we said, okay, we'll take that on, we'll litigate that. And we said, we've done all this, and we're doing all this at Magnolia Development. Couldn't you please, maybe hold back and not go after Holcomb and Fair on their liability for your past costs? And Holcomb and Fair were taking the position like, well, we were have an innocent purchaser defense ourselves because we didn't know, et cetera. We didn't add anything to the site. We didn't conduct any manufacturing things. So Ashley, we made a run by it. Would you consider releasing them? EPA said no, and that was the end of it. But the judge, found this some sort of nefarious. Wow, this is what's designed to prevent. So the court said, in indemnifying the Holcomb and Fair parties, Ashley took the risk that those parties might be found liable. And then Ashley's efforts to discourage EPA from recovering response costs reveals just the sort of affiliation Congress intended to discourage. After this ruling came out in May 2011, EPA came out with a September 21 guidance document on affiliation. I mean, it's addressing the Ashley case. EPA recognized the uncertainty, et cetera. It set forth EPA generally intends not to treat the following as disqualifying affiliations: relationships created during title transfer, does not intend to treat certain contractual financial relationships, certain types of indemnification as disqualifying. It, again, recited the fact that indemnity agreements don't relieve a party of circle of liability. However, in footnote 17, EPA says, however, please note the ruling in Ashley case. So that's my claim to fame notoriety of being a footnote in a guidance document going the wrong way. Last issue is no disposal after we took title. In the Fourth Circuit, we're dealing with law which says disposal not only includes active involvement in the dumping or placing, but also includes spilling or leaking. And the Fourth Circuit has ruled like if there are buried tanks on the property that are leaking, that's a disposal. If there's an unlined landfill on the site that's leaking, that's a disposal. If there's some sort of container that you're not aware of that's there and it's found to be leaking, that's a disposal, and that's going to defeat your BFPP status within the Fourth Circuit. You have to look at the law of the jurisdiction of the circuit and where your site is to know whether or not, because that's not a universally accepted proposition. Again, the court came back to the always concrete pads, and as I've said, the material was tested. Yes, there were hazardous substances found in the pads, mostly, heavy petroleum hydrocarbons mixed in. Our expert said wouldn't cause a release. Biased sampling out there didn't find a release. However, the court found that it's likely that there were disposals, and Ashley didn't test under the concrete pads, sumps, and trench to see if the soil under there was contaminated, and therefore Ashley did not prove that no disposals occurred on the site. The moral of that story is you may have to do some invasive testing if you've got something like that, and also, the burden of proving a negative is extremely hard. I mean, to prove something didn't happen when the other side's saying, well, it's possible this, it's possible that. Miscellaneous issues, I'm just going to whiz through these. Several of the parties tried to assert innocent landowner defenses. The court basically found that some of them had gone on and they had smoothed off, the surface, for their own parking, whatnot. The agitating contaminated soil and construction activities caused new releases of hazardous substances. Therefore, they didn't exercise due care and they're responsible parties. Just have to really be careful. This was a tenant who did the same thing. Again, he agitated contaminated soil. City of Charleston, yes, indeed, it is a circle of responsible party because it owned a street there. The judge gave it a 0% allocation. PCS has decided that it no longer really wants to pursue the city of Charleston, so it's dropped the appeal against Charleston. And then there's a case in California that was tried on BFPP status. It's a little bit more encouraging than the Ashley case. If you look at the facts of that case, there were tanks, and months and years after those tanks were there and after they'd taken title and TCE was found, the court still said, well, they acted reasonably in my estimation. And so take heart that, that. Okay, what do we take away from this? You've got to realize that in these sites, the BFPP status is going to be highly scrutinized by everybody, by the agencies, by the other responsible parties at the site, because they don't want you to have BFPP status. They're going to want you to help pay to clean it up. EPA's support, encouragement, involvement are certainly helpful, but as you saw, I mean, one of the parcels in the 20 that I showed you, EPA conducted a press release announcement at that site because it was the 1,000th successful completed CERCLA site cleanup. It was the McElroy site in Charleston. I mean, we had the support. It's not determinative. EPA guidance documents. You've seen what the statements that EPA has made in its guidance documents. Those are not binding on a judge, And when you come to looking at words such as reasonable, appropriate, affiliation by contract, it's remember that this entire issue, there are so many different perspectives in terms of looking at it. You've got EPA looking at it from their perspective, or state officials. You've got your developers who are trying, as we heard this morning, I mean, you've got to make it economically feasible. You've got to have efficiency, scheduling, and all of this sort of thing. And if you let those decisions run and drive your project, you're running the risk of these other things. Even the lawyers. I mean, the lawyers have to realize, one, what about environmental savvy in terms of conditions at the site, but to be experienced on what adversaries may do. And then you've got the courts. This particular judge did an excellent job, but I don't think, I didn't see any reported decisions that she had on CERCLA litigation or environmental litigation. But still, you've got legally trained people, not environmentally, not that they deal with it on a daily basis, looking at these issues and trying to apply the court's intention. Remember, these appropriate care, reasonable steps, they're continuing. Once you buy the property, you've got to continue on. Ashley was a BFPP when it purchased the site in November 2003, and the judge ruled that it lost that protection subsequently. So far as, again, scheduling action around development plans, you've really got to look at that. Really on reasonable care for the site, what the judge is talking about is good housekeeping. PCS's expert was an expert in the care of an ongoing operating facility. She had no CERCLA experience, didn't know anything about CERCLA standards for a site, and yet she opined, well, in my opinion, this should have been happening, that debris pile should have been removed, and those sumps should have been blah, blah, blah. I mean, really, it's good housekeeping. Intrusive sampling may be required as well. Let's see, what do I want to say? Again, you got to be, in making your inquiries into site conditions, you've got to look for any type of buried or other container of waste, because if it's leaking and you can't prove that there was a release, then you're sunk. And in concluding, I just want to say, what I found really kind of at the crux of all of this is, in 1980, Congress enacted CERCLA because of Love Canal and all that sort of thing, and to clean up these hazardous waste sites, and we want the polluter to pay, and we're going to make the liability net as wide as we possibly can. The current owner, yes, we're even going to make you a liable party. And the courts, in litigating all the CERCLA cases after that, made that liability net wide. I mean, a molecule of hazardous substance. I mean, the quantity doesn't matter. We don't have to fingerprint your waste. I mean, all that. Well, they did such a good job that it totally squelched people from coming in and developing contaminated property. And so in 2002, the Brownfields amendments were enacted, giving limitation of liability to a BFPP. But Congress still threw in these terms such as reasonable care, disposals, all of this sort of thing. So the courts are in the position, in this one case, they're in the position of applying CERCLA liability law to responsible parties, kind of under the guise of the 1980, liability, polluter pays. But in the same case, they're evaluating the activities of a person claiming bona fide prospective purchaser status where Congress tried to really just, say, look, the net's going to be cast a whole lot smaller to encourage these folks to buy the property. But this trial judge, in ruling on CERCLA issues, she's being cited, these CERCLA cases, for the liability portion, and she's applying it to the intent of the Brownfields program. I'm not articulating this like I want to. The courts want to give effectuation to the intent of the parties. And in 1980, Congress had one intent with enacting CERCLA, and in 2002, they had an intent almost diametrically opposed to it in granting liability protection to a BFPP. And now the court has to take the law that's out there and somehow reconcile, well, I'm going to say this is reasonable over here, this is not reasonable. It's a mess. This case is on appeal. Oral arguments have tentatively been scheduled for December of this year. Probably at the next Oklahoma Brownfields Conference, you're going to be talking about what the Fourth Circuit did with Ashley case. I appreciate your attention, and thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for that presentation on that landmark Brownfield case. Good luck next week when you prepare. Our next speaker is the Senior Counsel on the United States Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee for Ranking Member Senator James Inhofe. In his work there, he is responsible for the Superfund and Brownfields law, the hazardous and solid waste law, and mining issues for the committee. He is currently focused on developing bipartisan Brownfields reauthorization legislation. Please welcome Matthew Height.
Thank you for that. And before I get started, I just want to say that Senator Inhofe sends his regrets. The invitation was actually for him to be here, but unfortunately with the Senate schedule and votes, and he's a conferee of the highway bill and also has some activity going on in the Senate Armed Services Committee. He wasn't able to make it, but you get me instead here. So I'm the senior counsel and point person for Senator Inhofe and EPW minority staff on Brownfields. And for those of you that are not aware with the Senate procedure, EPW is the authorizing committee for Brownfields legislation and also for EPA. And I think for what I'm about to say, it'd be really quick just to go through a kind of very basic, crude example here of the difference between authorization and appropriations for most of you who aren't aware of that. But think of authorization as a mason jar, pretty big mason jar with a lid and a bunch of instructions. That's actually the law that Congress would create. As the example would be the mason jar. And EPW basically creates the mason jar, and then the appropriations determines how much to put in the mason jar. And then, for instance, in the jar you could say only put quarters and pennies and no dollar bills or whatever restrictions you want. Then the appropriators can determine what they want to put in there, but they can't put anything in there above the lid, and they can choose not to put anything in there as well. And the reason why I'm giving you that example is just to show the relationship in Congress, especially in the Senate, between the authorizing committees and the appropriators. And like I said before, Senator Inhofe is the ranking Republican, the lead Republican on EPW. And Brownfields legislation, Pat went through it as we discussed for a good portion of today in 2002, and he was instrumental in that. And the program authorization expired I believe it was fiscal year 2006. But the appropriators are allowed to continue to appropriate dollars, but the annual appropriation for the Brownfields program has been, for the last couple of years, around $165 to $169 million. And the authorization level, going back to the 2002 legislation, was about $250 million. So there's that difference of about $80 million. And that's going to become important when I talk about our priorities, but I want you to remember that. And I also realize I've the last one talking tonight, and I'm the last one to stand between you and the reception, so I will definitely be going fast here. And to start that off, the outlook for the 112th Congress, we only have about 6 months left, and as most of you are probably aware, there is a lot of gridlock. But there also are some bills that are getting done, and Senator Inhofe, like I said before, is working on the highway bill that passed the Senate and the House. There's bipartisan support. It's in conference right now. That's one example. There have been appropriations bills, continuing resolutions. So even though, as we're in a presidential election year and Congress continues to kind of get tighter and tighter in regards to letting things out, there are still things that are getting let out, and that's where I come in. We had a Brownfields hearing this past July where actually we had Oklahoma City's Mayor Mick Cornett as our witness. We had Evans Paul, and we had Aaron Sheff from Idaho DEQ, and David Lloyd from EPA was also one of our witnesses. And stepping away from that hearing, it was an oversight hearing on the Brownfields program, and there were definitely Democrats and Republicans, different views, but at the same time, I think we walked away with the feeling, and I know my boss did, and some of my other counterparts, their bosses did, that there was a lot of common ground, and that by reauthorizing the Brownfields program, you lock it in, and also the fact that the appropriations, because you're actually operating on the whim of the appropriators, which you would be if we locked it in as well, but it's better to lock it in for reauthorization. And so we wanted to see if there was common ground. We've been meeting at a staff level, and the meetings have increased. We've been meeting for quite a bit of time, a couple months, and we're actually working through language right now. And a lot of this, like I said, is at the staff level. This has not been signed off on. We have our own approval channels, but there is a process going on in the Senate to see if there is common ground for Brownfields authorization. And unfortunately, I can tell you where we're coming from. We're actually working with another prominent Democrat Senate office. I'm not at liberty to discuss who that is or what their priorities are, but I think you'd probably be impressed with that member and their priorities. And I would like to run through what we've been pushing for, just to give you kind of a preview of kind of where we're at. Going back to the authorization and appropriations discussion I just had, that probably wasn't too interesting, but let's just fix on the 80 million number. With the national debt and the current fiscal crisis and how Washington's handling it, this is not the time to push for an increase in the authorization of Brownfields program. And I know that probably is something that most of you don't want to hear, but unfortunately, that's something that is pretty important for us, especially with the fact that you've got that $80 million cushion that needs to be, I would say, probably met before you can come back and ask for an increase in authorization level. So by us saying no increase in authorization level for this round, that doesn't mean that you cannot increase the funding for the Brownfields program, and all of you, I'm sure, are supportive of that and want that, but there's you still have that $80 million cushion that's available that the appropriators then could come up with, and that could be an increase in the program. Next, one of the things that people have approached our office about is basically the timing, especially in some of the larger towns, when they get a assessment grant for a brownfield site. It takes a year to, put the application in, it takes a year to get it, then they'll come back and they'll get a cleanup grant, and then it'll take another year to apply for it, another year to get it. So we've got 4 years there in some cases for some situations. And an idea that's been floated around that they would like, a 104K grant that would be a multi-purpose grant that would include assessment and cleanup. And that's something that we're looking at, that we're very interested in. One of the concerns we would have is to make sure that all the money that we have in the program actually gets out there and gets used, and wouldn't I think our concern would be that we'd want the money probably to stay at EPA. Once the assessment went out, they would, like for instance, the municipality would start the assessment portion. They would get the funds immediately, and then once the assessment portion came back and said, you know what, you need a cleanup, the cleanup portion, we'd send that out. And if it didn't come back the way, then that money could be, that would be at EPA and be able to use for other grantees or other Brownfields grants, I should say. Sorry, I almost messed that one up. And the other issue that came up at our hearing that is a little bit difficult to explain, but also kind of builds upon what Thomas was talking about was liability. Senator Inhofe has always pushed for liability reforms. In the last, when the Brownfields bill was originally passed in 2002, and then also he has pushed that throughout various amendments throughout the past couple years, and for this process, we're still going to be pushing for some liability reforms. Unfortunately, unfortunately with Brownfields, I think there's a lot of common ground. I think it brings communities together. People of different views can really get together and agree on this program. Unfortunately, when you talk about liability reform, you kind of start to divide the room a little bit. But one of the things that we were surprised at during our hearing was that we found out that I think there is some potential for common ground on properties acquired prior to 2002 that municipalities, cities, through no fault of their own, just have acquired these properties. They actually are required to perform all appropriate inquiry. And just as Thomas was saying, this is definitely a challenge, proving a negative in a sense for this. And these are properties that could be put back in the stream of commerce, that could be developed, but these cities, municipalities aren't able to address these properties because of what was in the past bill. So that's something that we're looking at. The other thing that was brought to our attention, actually from some of our port guys, were waterfront properties, and emphasizing the redevelopment of brownfields on waterfront properties, not only on lakes, but more for purposes of Oklahoma rivers. The next item would be establishing a new grant under 104K. That would be a very, very small grant. This grant would be somewhere between, like, say, $3,000 to $7,000, and we would, I think right now the thinking would be the money would come from EPA, it would go to the state DEQ, and then it would cover the cost of a state DEQ officer to go out to a very small rural town or low populated area and basically do an inventory of the area to see if they would be eligible for brownfields, help them fill out an application, basically going to communities that aren't as familiar with the brownfields process to get them more involved in the process. And one of the things, when I say this, I kind of want to preface it. I know that EPA also has a TAB program, and this wouldn't compete with it, but it would be kind of complemented in a sense. And this would be something that would be established, that would be locked down, and wouldn't be dependent on the grant per se, like the TAB program sometimes can be. But the other issue with it, and especially with EPW, and especially with Senator Inhofe and our other members, is we do have, when it comes to brownfields, we have members from Idaho, Wyoming, some with large rural areas like Alabama, and we have a pretty diverse western kind of rural interest. And I feel like on the other side of the aisle, we've got a very big northeast interest where we have senators from very small, densely populated states. So we always kind of have that urban versus rural balance. And that's something that came up at that last hearing, that when we were thinking about that, this could be an area where we could address that. And I also kind of want to preface, I've met with David Lloyd from EPA. I think he's done a great job, and I know they are very, very cognizant of making and striking that balance, and I think they have done a very good job. I think when we're looking at this we feel like would kind of complement their efforts. by looking at this. We're also looking at other possible liability reforms, Good Samaritan, TSCA, RCRA, and we're also looking at the possibility of increasing grant amounts, especially in the 104K section. However, we're remaining cognizant that by increasing the grant amounts, we could possibly be shrinking the grant pool, and that's not something that we want to do just because the Brownfields program is spread out so far and wide. But we do hear folks' concerns that the grants are actually not enough, and we're looking to see if we can increase that. And going forward, I also just want to emphasize that, like I said, these are staff level talks, that there's been a lot of meetings. We're drafting, legislative text at the point, then we'll run it up, the flagpole and get everyone else involved in it. And then my boss is extremely detailed, and I know that our counterparts that we're working with is extremely detailed, so there will be some time, but we're hoping to try and get something done by this summer. And knowing full well we'll have a short window within this Congress, but at the same time, we feel that if we get something out there this Congress and it doesn't go anywhere, it'll get us at least we'll have a starting point for next Congress. And it will elevate the issue by having something out there. And quite frankly, with Brownfields, you never know, because there is a great amount of support on it, and just by looking around the room, everyone of different backgrounds in here, but this issue brings a lot of people together. And on Capitol Hill, when you talk about different groups or different associations or different lobbies, the Brownfields lobby is, I think, a very powerful lobby per se, because they have a great story to tell. They're connected. You've got the rural stories, you've got the urban stories, you've got the big stories, you've got small stories. And that all kind of makes a huge impression to all the senators, and also for moving something forward. And also, just in closing, I'm pretty quick here. I want to thank Lloyd and Barbara for all their help and getting out here. And if you guys have any questions, I can talk to you after, and thank you for your time.
Okay, the truth, he wants to go to the reception, okay? That's the truth. But anyway, thank you, Matthew. We appreciate your expertise and your update on the staff's view on the Brownfields reauthorization. For those who want to continue that conversation with him, he is going to go across to the networking reception at Petroleum Club at the Chase Building, which is right across, just south of the building, and on the 35th floor. And I want to thank Devin for sponsoring our networking reception. Tomorrow we got a full day of programming. Our continental breakfast starts at 7. Please plan to join us and enjoy your evening, and see you across the street. Yes? Oh, you have drink tickets in your name tag. There are 2 tickets back there. I didn't know that. Drink tickets back in the back, behind the name tag. Thank you, Barbara. See you soon.